thanks Tomasz in particular for sending this invite my way and doing just a ton of great work to help me learn about the Power community, the Power Platform community, and really helping bridge that connection. Adaptive Cards is, as you'll kind of see, is a very large net, targeting a lot of different customer segments from professional developers, which is cool that I really like that we're doing this 3-part series. So at the end of this, Tim Kadenbach, I think, is on the call as well, and will give a deep dive from the development angle. So yeah, I am really excited to be here and share with you what's going on with Adaptive Cards, how it might help you. And that's basically me. I'm working at Microsoft. I've been here a little while now and working on Adaptive Cards for a while. That is my email, Matt Heidinger. And I think it was Claire talking. You got my name right. A lot of people don't get my name right. It's Matt Heidinger. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. So thank you. Cool. So I'll just jump in. So and feel free to interrupt, especially if things aren't being clear. It's been a real whirlwind week. I'm sure everyone can possibly relate to that, but hopefully this will make sense. It was coming together quite hot. But here's what we're going to run through is what are adaptive cards? That's really the past, present, future angle of it. A very, very light lap around cards and Power Automate, where Tomasz is going to spend most of the time in 2 weeks really getting into the nitty gritty on some. I've seen him do demos before on this that are just some really cool ways to automate some business processes with UI, which is what Adaptive Cards helps to do. And then a roadmap in where we're going. And then, like I mentioned, so most importantly for me, I am very excited about this particular customer segment, to use kind of PME terms, which is outside of my wheelhouse, outside of my expertise. Adaptive Cards was originally tailored for quote unquote, pro developers, which is what was really cool. The Power Automate folks were able to take our tools and then make them available to power users or citizen developers in a really nice user-friendly package. And I think that's such a great opportunity for us to really dive into. And for me to do that, I really need to understand the needs of this community. So I am hoping to do that. Okay, so Adaptive Cards. This is the quick summary. They are cross-platform, cross-app snippets of UI. So the cross-app part is really the unique part of Adaptive Cards. It's there's tons of cross-platform UI out there. You may have heard of React Native or Xamarin from Microsoft or even Flutter, but that is really assuming you kind of own the app. You're building an app, where Adaptive Cards really help put your content inside of someone else's app, or it's your app and you want someone else to put content in. So there's usually an exchange. Adaptive Cards are really about two different parties, could be in the same company, could be in different companies, but usually exchanging UI. And they do that by sticking to kind of 3 fundamental principles, if my slides would advance. The content that shows up needs to be actionable. So there's these card-like contents, we'll see those, but you can have buttons on the cards so that I can click on it and the user can invoke some process. We also wanted to make sure that it always had native performance. So I'd actually have my phone connected. I'll try and stream that to see if that shows you, but you can kind of see. But the point is, an adaptive card always renders natively in whatever app that is hosting it. So if you're in a native iOS app like Teams, that adaptive card gets turned into native UI. And it does one other thing aside from being native. It blends beautifully into the app that's hosting it. So you'll sort of see there's adaptive cards in Teams, there's adaptive cards in Outlook, there's adaptive cards in other things. And if we're doing our job right, the adaptive cards should just blend into the background. A user shouldn't know what's the card and what's the rest of the app. And so those are kind of our 3 overarching principles. We originally designed it to work with the Microsoft 365 brand, which wasn't a brand back then. It was just a whole bunch of different products. But there was Outlook, Teams, Bot Framework has a thing called Web Chat. There was Cortana, and we also had some Windows connections as well. But thankfully, I happen to work in a organization within Microsoft that is very fond of open source. So we set out from the beginning. It was a fun, long battle 4 years ago, back before Microsoft was fully embraced in open source. We knew we wanted to make it open source so that people could use all of our code, all the specifications inside their own applications. And you'll see some of that here, but Tim, I'm sure, will really highlight the value that we got from sticking to that. We wanted to make it great with Microsoft 365, but we also wanted to empower different applications. Okay, so a lot of talking. Here's what a card looks like. You may have seen them. I never know how far into the past I should start with some of this, but it'll be kind of quick. This is actually a dev channel that my team uses. And we have two bots hooked up into here. One's GitHub and the other is Azure DevOps, so that when someone opens a pull request, a card gets delivered into our channel, or if a build fails, which is what's happening here, our iOS build has failed and we use Azure DevOps to do that. That's the value of adaptive cards. Taking content, part of your workflow, in this case, GitHub, it's here's the summary of a pull request. In Azure DevOps, it's like, hey, there was a build failure, and bringing it into the apps I'm already using. We really, as a user in this modern work, modern life world, we're using so many different apps. We're constantly hopping back and forth between different things. And if people apply adaptive cards right and we're successful, the hope is that the critical things, the high value things that a service offers, from GitHub to Azure DevOps to any number of things, to business processes, you can surface that content into the workflows people already have. And so this happens to be Teams. There's also adaptive cards in Outlook, and you'll notice these are actionable things. This one has been, I should have dug up the latest numbers. It's something like 11 million monthly actions are taken on cards in Outlook. And all of those mean every time someone has to approve something, we get a mail, you click on the link, it takes you to a website, you're hopefully logged into that website, you click approve, and then you close the tab. It's fine, it's not the end of the world, but it's a kind of bummer of a workflow. And so approvals is one really big area where right in your email that says, hey, someone needs approval to this, you can put an adaptive card in there, you can approve it, click right in there, and it says request approve without you ever even leaving the app. And then you just delete the email. And you don't have to, especially if you're on a phone.
And sorry, that's something I'll also show you in 2 weeks.
Oh, cool. Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. I'm sticking sort of high level and trying to paint a little bit of a background. Hopefully it is still somewhat interesting. And then Tim, I think, would chime in. I don't necessarily know if he's going to show this exact thing, but him and I worked together on a VS Code extension back when he worked for a company called Teamwork. Well, he did all the work. I just helped. But this was an adaptive card here in VS Code. But it all follows that same principle, that take the content. This is a task. Bring it into the app I'm already using. If I'm a developer, I'm in VS Code, bring it right there. Let me see my work items right there. And it's about thinking about those high value things that people are doing and bringing them to their apps. I do want to stress, though, it's not just Microsoft stuff. So a competitor to Microsoft Teams is called WebEx Teams. And this is a screenshot of WebEx Teams. They chose adaptive cards to power their extensibility platform as well, which I think is awesome, being from the adaptive cards team. And actually the Teams team is pretty happy about this too, because there are so many proprietary card stacks in the world. If you're building processes for Slack, you're doing one thing. If you're in WebEx Teams, you're doing another. If you're in Microsoft Teams, you're doing another. And it's a big tax on the industry to have all these proprietary UI formats. To me, it's like if you had to make a website for Firefox, a website for Chrome, and a website for Edge, what would the world be like? I mean, it's preposterous that we even think of that, right? Like every website works in every browser, but the card industry is not quite there yet. We don't really have that open standard. So this was cool seeing it on Microsoft company, a major company. Cisco's like $200 billion company, choosing adaptive cards. So, all right, here's how these things work. Basically, as I mentioned, there's always an exchange in adaptive cards. We use terms such as card author, and then we use terms such as host. And so you are most likely a card author in a lot of these cases. You're going to be building cards, you're going to be building them in Power Automate, you're going to be building them somewhere, and then you're going to be delivering them into an app such as Teams or Outlook. And so the end-to-end of how that all works is pretty straightforward, but as you'll see through this talk, there's a lot of opportunity to make it better, and that'll get into kind of the future-looking stuff. So the typical flow, though, is you go to our adaptive card designer. It's pretty user-friendly. It's certainly got some flaws, but if you've never written UI before at all, you should at least be able to make something that looks okay. And then you take that JSON, it's an adaptive card, it's just a JSON, and then you can put it into your Power Automate flow, and then you deliver that either to Teams or Outlook or your own apps. And then that's where the rest of the stuff kicks in that you don't have to worry about, like the native performance, like blending in. As a card author, you just, hey, here's my card, here's the JSON, and then Teams and Outlook do all the rest to make sure it looks great in their apps. Okay, let's switch over to see what that looks like. So everything adaptive cards lives at adaptivecards.io. I'll make this a little bigger. So you can go to adaptivecards.io at any time and kind of follow along. It's summary just of all these things. Where I usually like people to go to is to samples. And what these are a handful of card samples that kind of give you an idea of what kind of cards you can create. And so this is one of our more typical ones. It's like, hey, if someone needs to do something, here's who it was, here's a summary text, here's a couple facts about it. And then there's some actions like, oh, okay, I need to do this. Well, what should I set a due date? And you can see there's some level of interactivity here. I can click on this and I get a calendar picker down here. So I can set this to a date and I can say, do this today, please, or whatever. I can also click view. And what that would do is, maybe open this item. So you're in control of all this. You would build this up. And so like any good website, you should be able to click try it yourself. That would load up our adaptive card designer. And here you're in it's somewhat intimidating at first, but it's got your normal, what you'd expect, I think, from a designer tool. You've got all the elements you can bring in. So if I want to drag in a new piece of text, I can do that. And I can say, hello world here. I can change the text into something, like monospace and bold and make it green or yellow or blue and, large or something. And I can drag it around and that's, a text and there's images and there's rich text and there's actions and, a set of inputs, et cetera, et cetera. And you can use this dropdown to preview what this card would look like in different apps. So if you click on Teams, you can see what this card would look like in Teams Light. You could see what this card would look like in Teams Dark, perhaps as an Outlook actionable message, that's an Outlook, or even a Cortana skill. Hopefully you kind of get the point. The point is, you shouldn't have to necessarily worry about all this, but you can at least see how your card is going to change. And sometimes they do change somewhat significantly. If you look at this in web chat, the buttons are full width and they stack one on top of another. But if you go into Teams, they're not full width and they orient horizontally. So it is sometimes good, depending on how many actions you have, to be aware of the different stylistic treatments you might get. Make sure you don't use titles, button text that's too long or anything like that. So you can see the card structure, you can see, all sorts of things. And so that's your basic card. There's a handful of other ones that we like to show people, like this stock update. So this is, a card. And again, I want to stress that these are not, these are just samples that we just built. Like, to a user, this is a stock quote because it's got the typical information you would see, but you could rearrange this any way you see fit. If you click try yourself and you have no interest in, this section right here, we'll just delete it and maybe add a new text block for your own thing. And then here's your adaptive card. Here's the JSON. So now that we've got that adaptive card and say our slightly uglier stock card. So let's take that. Let's say, okay, this is the card we want to put into Teams. So now we take this JSON, you copy it, Control A, Control C, copy it, and here's where we're going to use it in a flow. So I will go through the whole step. So in Power Automate, I don't actually know if, are you familiar with Power Automate? Can I assume that? Should I assume that? Okay. So I'm clicking new flow and I'm manually triggering. I'm clicking new step, and then you can see where you can use adaptive cards in some of these by just searching for it. So there's a handful of connectors, or sometimes I get the term wrong, whatever these are called. I think they're connectors that support adaptive cards. So the simplest one though is Microsoft Teams, and I'm going to say I am going to post an adaptive card. I'm not going to wait for a response. Post an adaptive card to a channel as flow bot. Perfect. So a whole different variety of, you can send it to a user, you can send it to a channel. So I'm going to send this to my Teams channel for adaptive cards, and then my channel ID is going to be flow once it loads. Almost there. Okay, perfect. And then the message is the JSON. Not entirely intuitive what that is. Oh, I didn't copy it. Let's go back here. Control A, Control C, paste that in. Okay, I got this big card here. Hit save, hit test, and we will see this card, our slightly uglier stock card, in Teams. So I should sign in. I do have my phone here, so you can see I've obviously done this test a few times, but let's see. And the reason I was showing you my phone is just to kind of give you, so this is my actual phone that I'm just, oh, no, that's not the right, is that the one? Oh, did I copy? Okay, I guess I copied the wrong one. I thought it was, you get the idea. I copied the wrong JSON. It wasn't our stock card. It was this one. But here's the card. Here's the card in Teams, and then I've got another window here of Teams that has seemingly just, okay, there it is. And so because I'm in this team, I had to open up a web browser, but you can see Teams here. So here's my card in Teams. Works on the Teams mobile app, works on the Teams desktop app. You didn't have to know or care about that. You just had to design your card, take that JSON, so this is the one that I had built, and paste it in here. So that's a very simple version. And I'm not really going to go into any more details in the Power Automate stuff, but that's where, stay tuned in 2 weeks, where Tomasz is going to show you how to make a little more realistic example with some dynamic data and all the, you know, it's probably not very likely that your card is going to be 100% static at all times. So you'll be able, you know, if you're building a stock card, obviously you want to get the latest stock quotes and whatnot. Any questions or anything, feel free to just kind of let me know. Otherwise, I'll just keep roaring through it. So I'm going to come back to this slide a little bit. It probably needs to be updated, but hopefully it at least sort of makes sense. Because one of the things that I've learned as I work with the needs of, say, Power Automate customers and Teams Pro developers and Outlook developers and people in their own apps, like, there's this common life cycle that you do. You design your card, you use your card, and then you deliver your card to different apps. That there's a lot that we can do to improve that workflow. You might consider it the inner loop testing, if you're familiar with that metaphor. But the inner loop of an adaptive card developer is create your card, fill your card with data, deliver it, test it, and kind of repeat. So there's a lot that we can do to improve some of that. And so one example is a slightly better version of this, and this is where I'm really going to stick kind of high level. And I'm very certain Tomasz will go into a lot of detail here, but instead of this post your adaptive card as a flow bot to a channel, what I'm going to do is a different version of that lets you wait for a response. So this one is post an adaptive card to a Teams channel and wait for a response. And the only thing I'm going to show you in this one is some improvements we've made to that workflow. Whereas previously, I'm over here at adaptivecards.io. I'm in the designer here. It's a completely separate thing. It's a completely standalone tool that I have to now paste that JSON into my flow. And if I ever want to change that card, I have to copy that JSON, put it back into the designer, and it's a lot of copy and pasting. So what we improved upon in this preview connector is an integrated adaptive card designer. So with this particular flow, and you'll see some variations of this. So long term, you can expect a lot of this stuff to converge, and a lot of these improvements and these quality of life improvements will be available everywhere. But I can click create adaptive card, and this is the adaptive card designer, the same exact one from adaptivecards.io, just right here. And so now it's much more integrated. You know, I can say hello world here and do all the stuff. I can bind to data, whatever. Click on save card. I can always edit my adaptive card. Whoa, what have I done there? Oh, I've broken something. Should I wait or should I refresh? That is
it's still a preview in experimental mode.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yeah, in fact, yeah, you might have to turn on experimental settings. Do you still have to? Do you know?
Yes, it's still under experimental.
Okay, yeah, oh, there almost came back. So yeah, you'll see a lot of what I'm going to show you is we've got the basics working, but there's a lot of quality of life improvements that we're certainly going to make over the next little while. But that was really, there's one other thing in there that I, again, wasn't going to go into details, but you can see it in, say, my phone here. Well, this card, that same thing has, you know, a set due date, and I can click view. So you can clearly collect information from people that when I hit submit, it will then go back to your flow. You can continue processing. So this one that's called wait for response, you can actually get the data out. So you can send a card to teams, have inputs in it. The user can fill in that information, hit submit. It gets sent back to your flow, and then do whatever you want with it. Put it in SharePoint, send it as an email, post it to another channel. You can do whatever you can in flow. You just extract that data out. But you can now complete kind of an end-to-end scenario of collecting data from users in a nice UI format without being a UI designer. I think that's one of the big, you know, value props here, is that's a relatively user-friendly tool that helps it makes it easy to build some kind of nice looking cards. So, all right, let's keep going. So the changes here are that we have an integrated card designer where the JSON, no more copy and pasting. It's just right there in the flow you're using, and you can then receive a response from Teams back to your flow. And right now, that only works in Teams. The Outlook stuff, you can do lightweight cards, you can do approval style cards, but you can't get very complicated with the types of actions. So still some gaps that, you know, I'll be forthcoming about, but, you know, still some work to do. But some of this stuff, you know, you can absolutely get started with today, especially the Teams stuff. Okay, that was the demo we just did. So let me talk a little bit about adaptive card templating. So I'm not gonna, again, get into super details here, but this was that stock card that I showed. And you can see that 105.51 and all these values, they're hard-coded right in here, which is, again, pretty unrealistic, right? The card that you're probably gonna send is probably gonna have some kind of dynamic data. And that's where adaptive card templating helps. And if you're used to building complex flows, you're already familiar with a variation of this concept. It is slightly different, and I will call that out. Adaptive card templating was based on the Logic Apps syntax, which is what you're using in Power Automate. But basically, instead of hard coding those values, you write these binding expressions. So $curly brace name, $curly brace symbol, $curly brace quote. And then you add the data object. When those two things are combined together, the template plus the data, you then get the adaptive card that you originally started with. The benefit being that now you've got this reusable card template. It's a much better separation of concerns. Now I can reuse this thing, and all I have to do is change the data. I can separate out what's the static content and what's the dynamic content. And then you get, you know, that card. You can write some expressions in templates. So again, some of this is probably not very useful to you folks, but we extracted out the expression language that you use in Power Automate, and basically are releasing these cross-platform SDKs so that those expressions can be evaluated on every platform. That means that long term, if you can write a card like this, like so for example, in that stock card, these are the expressions, what we mean. So there's an if expression here, a conditional. So if the change, as in the stock is up, we want this. This is the true statement, put an up arrow, otherwise put a down arrow. A lot of times the data won't be in the shape that you necessarily want. So, you know, as humans, we see currency with 2 decimal places, but the decimal might not always be there. So there's functions that you would expect that exist in, say, Power Automate, where I can format a number to give it 2 decimal places. I can create percents by doing simple arithmetic evaluation, and you kind of get it. And so that means that we can take these template with expressions and this data and then get the appropriate thing. So like I was saying, you know, this close 128.9, well, that would look weird on a card. We always see 90, like this says humans, you know, read currency. So you typically need to kind of manipulate the data. So while I think that's all very cool, Tomasz, you can kind of correct me if this is wrong, but I think it's not really possible in Power Automate without jumping through some hoops. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Yeah, that's correct. So today the templating is just in a very basic way possible, so that action that you showed in experimental features, under experimental features, it allows us to simply pass templating variables, but those just straightforward plain text like variables. So we can't use any kind of templating expressions, any kind of those formatting loops and other things. So gotcha. It's safer to say it is not yet supported.
Yeah, yeah, yes, that is probably safer to say. But it opens up a lot of doors, and we are trying to work with that team to figure out like what are some of these gaps. Tomasz has been critical. People like you who are using this every day are really critical for us to understand what those gaps are, so that we can prioritize properly. Is really, you know, is not having templating. I know for certain customers it's a major non-stopper, but with Power Automate there are other ways to fill in dynamic data. So is it a nice to have or is it must have? We kind of need to know some of that. Okay, so let's peek into the future a little bit. And again, this slide, the pictures, I think the more I look at them, I'm like, they could use some updating. But the hope is that, okay, what I showed you in the very beginning was you're at a different website, adaptivecards.io, you're copying the JSON, you're pasting it. If you ever want to change it, you're copying it back into the other place. It's not a super great development experience. The improved version of that, as you saw with the card designer integrated right in the flow, that's a pretty big improvement, especially if you never need to use that card in another flow. But what if you have a scenario where you've got the same card, you want to use it in multiple flows or multiple steps in the same thing? Well, even with the integrated designer and even with all that stuff, it's still coupled to that one individual action. You're still copying, pasting a lot of JSON around. And what can we do? That's basically the problem space. So what can we do to try and solve that? And so this is a very early look at something that I'm only showing it to you to try and get you excited because it's not really usable, but it is hopefully something that you can sort of see where we can go with this thing. So this was a really fun project I got to work on. Oh, really? Single sign-on. All right, hang on. Let's see if I can get this to work. 50, approve. Let's see if this works because 2FA has been a pain lately. Sorry, bear with me. We have very long password requirements. Okay. Looks like it's going. Yes, please stay signed in. Okay, cool. It's going. Okay, so this was a really fun, I had 8 interns that I got to work with. I kind of pitched this idea to them. They got excited about it. And so this is basically what we came up with. Now, we got a lot of excitement on the intern project. There's very few people I show this to that are like, yeah, you should obviously build this. It's just been harder to convince my management that we need to build this. But here's basically what it is. It's a user-friendly front-end dashboard for managing all of the types of cards that you might want to create. So if I log in here, you can see I've logged in, I can click new card, and I get the same thing that you've seen a million times. Hello, where are you guys in Scotland? Well, I guess you're virtual, but we'll just say Scotland anyway. For those of you in Scotland. So I made a card, I can click save, and then I give my card a name, VPG card. I can tag it with what is this one? This one's a demo card, sure. Hit save, and then I can publish that card. So I can, if any of you are familiar with, SharePoint workflows where you check something out, you save it, there's versioning, it's that. It's another name for this is the card management service. It's like a CMS for your cards. So you can give things a name. This is the 1.0 card. I can hit save. It does bug out right there, but if I go back, it should come back. And what we hope to have with this is something where you can log in with your AAD or MSA, your basically whatever your tenant information is, and all these cards get stored in your tenant in a nice compliant area where you can now access them. So here's the card right here. I can see who created it. Has it gotten any usage? I can create a new version of it, so a V2 version, or unpublish it, or share it. Basically all the things you would expect to have in a content management system. So how do then I use it? And that's where I don't have an easy way to demo this just yet, but I can give you a peek of what that would look like. So let me show you the adaptive cards template service. If I go into custom connectors, I'll just do this one. This is you have to bear with me a little bit because I'm just trying to paint the pieces again because it's not fully working. But what we have is a public template service. The way this would you'd expect to work, I actually have a screenshot of it that might explain it a little easier. So you're in your CMS here, you're creating your cards, you've got a product card, you've got a flight details card, you've got a product, whatever details. And then in Power Automate, you would add a connector that's like, oh, okay, connect to my CMS. This drop down here would show all of these card templates that you've created, and then you just pass in the data to them. So the template, so whatever step you have, if it's product details, you have to pass it the product data. But the UI, the template itself, all exists in this user-friendly dashboard. Makes it very easy to reuse these cards in multiple flows. It gives you a nice centralized user-friendly place to view and edit the cards. It just tries to hide the fact that all these things really are, at the end of the day, is a bunch of JSON flying back and forth. But the more you get into it, the more real world it gets, the more you realize that you can lose stuff and it's just a little bit cumbersome. So this was an attempt at figuring out how can we make that a little more integrated, a little more straightforward, a little more friendly if you have collaboration, especially if you're in a big organization. And maybe you have access to some designers who want to, review the cards. The CMS gives you a nice way to create versions of the cards and just a nice user-friendly way where then the flow itself is very simple. It says, hey, what are you trying to do? I'm trying to take this template, the product details one, and grab this data, and you just get it from back in the flow. So it separates that stuff out a little bit. And this is a variation to that shows we do have a public template service, which gets into the second thing I want to show you. And the reference I always make, because I sometimes try and be clever, is what is the cheapest way to get anything done? Well, the cheapest way to get anything done is to have someone else do it for you. And so we came up with this idea of adaptive components. And the whole premise behind this is why build a stock card if someone else has built a stock card? You know, how often are we reinventing the wheel? And it's not all the time, but in a lot of cases, we end up just, you know, coming to adaptive cards, oh, clicking that sample, pasting in that JSON. I shudder to think how many variations of that stock card exist in the world. And so components is an attempt to clean that up a little bit, or make it so we can share these reusable components. So this is a very early preview. As you can see, I just had to refresh because it is buggy. So this looks like the Adaptive Cards website, but this is a custom build of the website that has this experimental feature. So don't go to Adaptive Cards that are looking for this, but we have approved the design of this. We're just trying to figure out like where it fits in our roadmap, and that's kind of the final thing I'll get to in this. So I'm actually doing okay on time. We'll just kind of be a roadmap, like what's going to work where. But here's how this would work. So here's a component, and I would drag over a component, and you can see its type is component, and I need to pick a component from the list. And ignore that this UI is somewhat, it can be improved. But what you can picture here is we've got a bunch of domains. So github.com/issue, this is the issue component, or Microsoft Graph has a file component, and we'll actually pick that one. There is a schema.org business. So if you just want, you know, you grab data from Yelp, or you know, you've got this business, like these are all decent looking cards. And why should you have to build the UI for that? Just tell us the data behind it. So let's pick the file one. And you can see what's happened here is it said, and we actually have a designer experience as well. So the component name is graph.microsoft.com/file, which again is just for Microsoft Graph, expect a whole bunch of components for the graph, like users and files and all the things you would expect to see. Now I've got a file basically in here. But the UI for this file, you can see it's Word document, status report.docx. That's all passed along in these properties. So if I look at the component, again, ignore all the extra data in here. The component has a name and it's got all these properties. And this is just the raw metadata that you would get from the Graph API. So if you queried the Graph API, this is the data you would get back. So if I were to come in here and just change the file name or the file type or anything like that, you would see the UI get updated. And as another example, the stock one's always the easier one to do. Let me just type in the name quickly. So iextrading.com/ and dang, bumming, it's bugging out apparently. I thought it was stock quote. Oh, there it goes. Okay. And then you can see here, just like I showed you before, we can change the symbol. Let's change it to like Apple, and you see the UI updating. I can take the change. This is a kind of cool thing. So the change, what is the stock up or down? If I change this to negative $2.69, you can see that the arrow goes down, the text turns red, just like you would expect. So this is some pretty nice UI. And all I had to do was say, hey, drop in this component. It's the stock component. Here's the data. And all the UI, all the layout, all that complexity is all baked into the component. It got downloaded on the fly. And long term, we'll have a centralized component registry where all these components will live. Currently, they're you know, in a GitHub folder where anyone can contribute components, anyone can update them. So this we think is going to take us a long way towards just sharing a lot of this common reusable stuff. So that you can just drop this into your card, not paste anything in, not rebuild the stock card 1,000 times. Like just say, hey, here's a stock card, here's a file, here's all these things, and just pass in the data you got from either a previous step in your flow or by hitting the Graph API or etc. Okay, I think that was everything. The last link I'm going to share and talk through is the roadmap. So if you go to AK, again, I'll have the link in the deck, but it's ak.ms/AC roadmap. You will get to this page. And this is basically where we talk about what we're going to be working. It starts out in the planned tab, so a handful of things. I won't go into all the details, but grouped by at our rendering layer, at the templating layer, at the ecosystem. So you'll see like adaptive cards and Power Virtual Agents, a Power Automate connector for the template service and component model, etc. Card author services. So it's all planned. All that stuff is stuff we hope to release. Launched will just tell you, what was released. And then under consideration is where kind of our bucket list of all the things we want to add at some point. It's a pretty big list of things we want to get to, but this is your place to tell us what you need. Anyone can click submit an idea, tell us something more than GFG, tell us what you need, how important it is, and all you have to give us is an email address, or you can vote on existing issues. So you can see 22 people have asked for a thumbs up / thumbs down control. This is basically your opportunity to kind of influence the product direction from what features you need to what integrations you need, such as improved Power Automate stuff. Okay, I think that was what I wanted to cover as a lap around that. Like I said, that's the roadmap. I assume I'll have somewhere to send you guys this deck because there are a handful of resources. These were some questions I was just gonna kind of tee up. So we did 2 weeks ago, we did a focus group with the Power Platform community. And these are the questions, it was really all Power Automate people. But these were some of the things we were trying to figure out, how adaptive cards fit into their flows. Are you using in the beginning, the middle, or the end? Why, what's working well with authoring flows, what isn't? Are you using, how are you using the dynamic tokens and the data binding? Which apps are you sending it to? Teams is our deepest integration, but is that meeting your needs or do you need others? One, especially if you're doing this, are there common tasks you find tedious or impossible to achieve? That's always a good question to find out what people are, what's the friction that exists that maybe you're not aware of. And then there's the branding is somewhat limited. Right now, all those cards come from Flowbot, which is cool because it's super easy to add to your team and it just makes it easy, but it also takes away a little bit. Like it says, this was from Flowbot from Matt. So there's kind of this attribution thing, which we are making some improvements to the way cards are attributed soon in Teams. But is that, is that good enough for what people need? And then I always love asking this question, if you had a magic wand, what would you add or change? So that was just kind of give you an idea of what I'm hoping to learn if people did find this useful or are using it every day and want to engage. Those are just to kind of tee it off. And then I've got a resources slide, and I think that was it. And then I kind of can take any questions, and I have this one too, but I can come to that one whenever you guys want. Yeah, that was what I had.
Thank you so much, Matt.